Brilliance Audio presents Finn by Melody Ann, performed by Teri Linden. Joseph Anderson wasn't a man who lived with regrets. He'd enjoyed a blessed life with family and friends, and even if there had been bumps in the road along the way, he figured that was all just a part of who he was today. He was in the prime of his life, in his humble opinion. He didn't care that his hair and beard had gone white many years earlier. He didn't care that his smooth skin had become wrinkled, and he didn't care that it took him a few extra seconds to rise from his favorite easy chair in his den after having a drink of fine scotch and possibly sneaking a few puffs from his favorite cigar. Age was just a number, and it wasn't something that would define him or slow him down. There was still a lot of life to live, and he wasn't going to waste a single moment of time. Right now, he was sitting back in his favorite chair, a smile on his lips. Family. At the end of the day, it all came down to family. Whether a man was rich or poor in the financial sense, he'd die a wealthy man if he had a good family. Maybe there had been a time or two in Joseph's life he'd, helped his family along. And maybe, just maybe, they might have called that meddling. But to date, he hadn't steered a single one of his children or nieces and nephews wrong. And he'd even been kind enough to help some of his friends out in expanding their beautiful families. That was commitment, in his humble opinion. Instead of making accusations at him, they should be throwing big parties in his honor, thanking him for seeing what they needed before they were even aware they needed it. But a man didn't do what he did to be praised. He did it because he loved big time. Everything Joseph did was done on a grand scale, and that was something that would never change.
"Charlie, can you get the car ready?"
Joseph asked over his speaker.
"Yes, sir. Where would you like to go?"
"The hospital," Joseph told him. It took a few seconds longer to stand than it used to, but soon he was moving toward the door. After a couple of steps, the kinks in Joseph's back were gone, and he picked up his pace as he made his way to the front of the house. That morning, Joseph had received a phone call that had stunned him. It took a lot to surprise a man who'd lived many lifetimes in his short years on this earth, but this call had at first shocked him, and then brought him immense pleasure after he'd sat there for a while, basking in the news he'd been given. Joseph had nearly hung up the phone when no one had answered his hello, but something in him told him to wait. Then she'd spoken. He hadn't recognized her voice. Why would he have? It had been over 30 years since he'd last seen her. Sandra Anderson. She'd been married to his awful uncle, Nielsen Anderson, who had faked his own death, then run away like the coward he'd been his entire life. Joseph hadn't expected to ever hear from his uncle's wife again. She'd come many years before, a baby in her arms, and then she'd disappeared into the night. Joseph had used his unlimited resources trying to find her, but it had done no good. She'd vanished without a trace. Now, over 30 years later, she was back. And sadly, she was dying. And one of her last requests was to speak to Joseph. Sandra had been 25 years younger than Joseph's uncle, but that man had always been a terrible person. After faking his own death, he'd waited for his wife and infant son to collect the insurance money. Then he'd grabbed her up and whisked her away to South America, where he'd had 4 more children with her. Once her husband had died, Sandra had scrimped and saved and brought her children back to Seattle, but she'd been ashamed of the money she'd stolen from Joseph many years before. It broke Joseph's heart that he'd missed out on knowing his family because of a little bit of cash. Money came and went, but family was forever.